You know, when we think of a 20th century dictator, a certain image comes to mind, right? It's a playbook. They seize power in a coup, they purge anyone who looks at them funny, and they always have an escape plan. We tend to just lump Adolf Hitler into that same category. But what if he wasn't just an exception to the rule? What if, on almost every single measure, he was the complete opposite? See, the normal dictator's playbook is all about one thing: self-preservation. Staying alive, staying in power. But just look at Hitler's record. Power wasn't seized, it was handed to him. His inner circle, incredibly stable. There was no plan for a dynasty, and instead of a golden parachute, he ordered the total destruction of his own country. Every other dictator was playing a game of survival. Hitler, it seems, was playing for something else entirely. And that one chilling detail, well, it changes everything. So let's start right at the beginning. Most dictators you can name, Stalin, Mao, Castro, they clawed their way to the top. They fought revolutions, they led coups. It was all about force. Hitler's path to power was, well, it was something else entirely. He was simply appointed. Yeah, on January 30th, 1933, President von Hindenburg just made him chancellor. It was a messy backroom political deal, no civil war, no revolution. And then, in just 53 days, using the Reichstag fire as an excuse, a couple of decrees and one final vote in parliament gave him total dictatorial power. It all happened through the system, not by overthrowing it. And that final vote, wow. The final tally was 441 to 94. Just let that sink in for a second. The German parliament, the very body designed to be a check on power, voted by a supermajority to just sign away its own authority. Democracy wasn't toppled, it was legally dismantled from the inside out. I mean, what other dictator was just handed the keys to the kingdom like that? Okay, so he's in charge. Now surely he pulls out page 1 of the dictator's playbook. Start purging your rivals to consolidate power, right? Well, again, that's not what happened. Just look at this comparison. Hitler's inner circle, guys like Goering, Goebbels, Himmler, they were with him from the early days, and they were still there at the very end in 1945. Now look at Stalin. During his Great Terror, he executed around 750,000 people. He wiped out his own revolutionaries and absolutely gutted the Red Army on the eve of World War II, killing most of his top commanders. Why? Because Stalin was more terrified of his own generals than he was of Hitler. Hitler, on the other hand, never seemed to see his own guys as a threat. And this brings us to maybe the weirdest, most perplexing part of this whole story: his command of the military. As soon as Hitler took personal control of the army, a really bizarre pattern started to emerge. His decisions started to defy the most basic goal of any wartime leader, which is, actually winning the war. This quote from historian Jeffrey Magarji just nails it. Hitler was obsessed with the tiny details, the movement of a single division, but he had no grasp of the big picture. He essentially won a war against his own professional military experts, who could only watch in horror as he made one strategically catastrophic decision after another. It was a total victory for ideology, even if it meant sacrificing the very strategy that could have saved his country. Which really brings us to the central question of the entire war. Why would any dictator willingly sacrifice his best army? And the textbook example, of course, is the Battle of Stalingrad. His entire Sixth Army is completely encircled by the Soviets. Every single one of his generals knew they had to try and break out or the men were doomed. But Hitler refused. He forbade retreat. He ordered them to hold their ground, promising this massive airlift that his own Air Force commander told him was literally impossible. The result was a foregone conclusion. In February of 1943, 91,000 starving, freezing German soldiers were forced to surrender. And of those 91,000 men, fewer than 6,000 ever saw Germany again. See, this wasn't just some strategic miscalculation. It was a choice. A dictator who won't let his generals save his best army isn't acting in his own self-interest, unless survival isn't actually the ultimate goal.
And that's when you get to the core of it. The Nazi regime wasn't built for survival. It wasn't built to keep Hitler in power, or even, bizarrely, for Germany to win the war. It was built for one thing: an apocalyptic racial mission. Everything, and I mean everything, was secondary to that single horrifying goal.
I mean, think about this for a second. It's 1944. The German army is collapsing on both fronts. They're starved for men, for fuel, for ammunition. And what does the regime do? They divert trains,
Precious railway cars that were desperately needed to bring supplies and reinforcements to the front lines were instead used to ship Hungarian Jews to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. That tells you everything. The war was just the vehicle for the killing, not the other way around.
So, what happens when a regime isn't actually built for survival? Well, for one, it doesn't plan for the future. Why would it? There is no tomorrow. Just look at the other regimes that were built to last. The Kims in North Korea, the Assads in Syria, the Castros in Cuba. They all built these multi-generational dynasties. Hitler? He had no children, no designated heir, and only bothered to name a successor in the final hours before his suicide. And that successor state? It lasted a grand total of 8 days. Nothing was ever meant to outlive him. In fact, in the end, he did everything he could to make sure of it. In March 1945, he issued what's known as the Nero Decree, an order for the complete and total destruction of all German infrastructure, bridges, factories, food supplies, you name it. He actually told his minister, Albert Speer, that if the war was lost, the German nation had proven itself weak and it deserved to be destroyed. He was literally punishing his own people for failing him. So when we hear about Hitler's suicide in the bunker, it's easy to see it as an isolated act. But it wasn't. It was the peak of a massive wave of self-destruction across the entire regime, something we've never really seen before or since. The numbers are just staggering. Huge percentages of top generals, admirals, and party leaders all took their own lives. And so did over 7,000 civilians in Berlin alone. The whole system was designed to self-destruct. Okay, there is one last final paradox we need to talk about, and it might be the biggest lie of all, the one that powered the entire machine. It's the massive gap between the public image and the private reality. So the public image, very carefully crafted by Goebbels, was of this disciplined, almost monk-like figure who denied himself all pleasure for the good of Germany. The reality? He loved rich foods, he drank wine, and he maintained a long-term partner, Eva Braun. But the biggest lie, the most staggering one, was about money. While he was preaching sacrifice and self-denial to the German people, Hitler was secretly amassing one of the largest personal fortunes on the entire continent. Historians estimate his peak net worth was a jaw-dropping $43.5 billion in today's money. It's very likely he was the richest man in Europe at the time of his death. And he built this fortune by basically turning the state into his personal piggy bank. He took royalties from sales of his book, Mein Kampf, which became a mandatory wedding gift. He literally got a personal cut from every single postage stamp that had his face on it. He got huge annual payments from industrialists that went into a personal slush fund. That whole image of the selfless leader, it was a complete and utter fabrication. So, let's just put this all together. He was handed power. He kept his team intact. He lost a war by prioritizing a twisted mission over victory. And he built a state designed to self-destruct. And this leads to a final, grim irony. Normal dictators are selfish. They want to survive, they want to build dynasties, they want to escape with their money. And in a really horrible way, it's that very selfishness that sometimes keeps their countries from completely collapsing when they're gone. Hitler lacked that basic instinct for self-preservation. His regime wasn't built to live, it was built to die. And it was determined to take tens of millions of people with it. Which leaves us with this deeply unsettling question to think about. If the very thing that made Hitler an opposite among dictators is also what made him uniquely catastrophic, does that mean every other dictator was, in their own terrible way, the safer kind?